The finality of the act was in the sound the door made. It was not a slam of anger, but the dull, heavy thud of a lock seating into its frame, a sound of permanence. On the other side of that oak door was everything Ilara had ever known: the warmth of the hearth her husband Thomas had built, the smell of baking bread, the worn floorboards that held the memory of her children's first steps. On this side, there was only the biting November wind and the 4 coins Silas, her brother-in-law, had pressed into her palm. "It's more than you're owed," he'd said, his face a mask of strained piety. "Thomas left debts. The farm is mine now, by law." The men from the town council, including Mayor Gable himself, had stood behind him, nodding gravely. They had looked at her, a widow of 30 with 3 small children clinging to her skirts, and seen only a burden, an untidy loose end in the town's ledger. She looked down at her small, huddled flock. Caleb, at 10, tried to stand tall, his small fists clenched at his sides, his eyes burning with a fury too old for his face. Leah, 7, shivered, her face buried in the folds of Ilara's worn wool dress, and in a sling against her chest, baby Samuel slept on, blissfully unaware that his world had just been reduced to the clothes on his back and the cold air in his lungs. Silas had made one final, magnanimous gesture. He handed her a folded piece of paper. "The deed to the bridge lot," he announced, loud enough for the councilman to hear his generosity. "It was Thomas's folly, a worthless patch he bought for a song. But it's yours now, a place to call your own." A few of the men shifted their feet. The bridge lot was a joke in Providence Creek, a sliver of muddy, flood-prone rock and silt directly beneath the great stone bridge at the edge of town. No one had ever found a use for it. It was a place for dumping refuse and sheltering from a sudden rain shower, nothing more. What she had left could be counted in moments. 4 silver coins. The deed to a patch of mud. The clothes they wore, thin and patched. And one other thing, an asset so absurd it had drawn a dry chuckle from Silas. Old Bess, her husband's last gift to her, a pregnant sow of formidable girth and placid temperament. She was Ilara's, not the farm's, a fact Thomas had made clear in a handwritten note before the fever took him. Silas had grudgingly shoved the sow's lead rope into her hand. "Take the beast. She'll fetch a few meals at least, before you starve." Mayor Gable stepped forward, clearing his throat. He was a man whose compassion was always outweighed by his sense of order. "Woman," he said, not unkindly, "the sensible thing is the county orphanage for the children. They will be fed and housed. We can find a position for you as a laundress at the inn." Ilara looked from the mayor's earnest, foolish face to her children. She imagined Leah's bright spirit dimmed in a gray uniform, Caleb's proud anger broken by institutional routine, and Samuel passed from hand to hand like a bundle of rags. A cold, hard resolve settled in her chest, extinguishing the last embers of her grief and replacing them with something much hotter, something like iron. She did not look at Silas or the mayor again. She turned her back on the house she was born in, the town that had judged her, and the life that was over. She walked not to the inn nor east toward the county seat, but to the mercantile. With her 4 coins, she did not buy passage on a wagon or a sack of flour that would last a week. She bought a good, heavy felling axe with a hickory handle, a small cask of nails, and a heavy bag of salt. The shopkeeper, Mr. Finch, stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "An axe, Ilara? What in God's name for?" "For building," she said, her voice quiet but steady. The walk to the bridge was the longest journey of her life. It was only a few hundred yards, but each step was weighted with the stares of the townspeople. They watched from their windows and doorways as the widow, her 3 children, and a fat pig made their slow, pathetic procession toward the river. She heard the whispers, the sad shakes of the head. It was a funeral march, and they were all mourners for her foolish pride. When they finally reached the riverbank and descended the muddy track to the land beneath the bridge, the full weight of her decision crashed down upon her. It was worse than she remembered. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The ground was a churned mess of mud and sharp-edged stones, littered with broken bottles and rusted tins. Above them, the massive stone underbelly of the bridge arched into the gloom, weeping moisture that fell in a constant, miserable drizzle. The roar of the river was a constant, deafening companion. Caleb's face fell. "Mother, we're not staying here?" Leah began to cry, a thin, hopeless sound that the river's noise almost swallowed. Ilara looked at the dark, wet space, at the junk-strewn ground, at the oppressive weight of the stone overhead. For one terrible moment, she believed them all. Silas, the mayor, the whole town. They were right. This was a grave. This was not a place to live. It was a place to die. The iron resolve in her chest felt like a cold, heavy stone. Despair, sharp and debilitating, made her knees weak. She sank down, pulling her children close against the base of one of the colossal stone piers that supported the bridge. She pressed her back against the rough-hewn granite, seeking some small stability in a world that had turned to liquid. And then she felt it, a sensation so subtle she at first dismissed it as a trick of her mind. The stone was not wet. It was not slick with the river's chill. Where her back pressed against it, the rock was dry. More than dry, it held a faint, deep-seated, not warmth precisely, but a lack of cold. It was as if the great mass of the pier had soaked up the pale afternoon sun and was now holding it deep within its core, refusing to let it go. Ilara pressed her palms flat against the stone. The surface was cool, but beneath it there was a profound neutrality, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the air. She looked up. The bridge deck, 50 feet of solid rock and packed earth, was a perfect shield. No rain or snow could ever touch this place. The two massive piers, 20 feet thick, formed natural walls that blunted the force of the wind, which howled overhead but only eddied gently in the space below. Here the air was still. She looked at the river, a source of endless water. She looked at the riverbanks, thick with willow and cottonwood for fuel. And she looked at the stone pier, a wall already built, a foundation already laid, a thermal battery waiting to be charged. The despair did not vanish, but it receded, beaten back by a new and ferocious thought. The town was wrong. Silas was wrong. This was not a worthless place. This was a fortress. The iron in her soul began to glow. She stood up, her movements stiff but purposeful. "Caleb," she said, her voice cutting through the river's roar. "Gather every piece of dry wood you can find under the overhangs. Leah, take Samuel and stay right here, against the stone. Do not move." She tied old Bess's rope to a sturdy root jutting from the bank, then took up the new axe. It felt heavy and right in her hands. The work began. It was a brutal, relentless assault on her body and the unyielding landscape. Her first task was to clear a space against the pier. She used the axe to hack away at thorny bushes and drag away the town's refuse. Her hands, soft from years of mending and baking, were raw within the first hour. By dusk, blisters had formed, broken and bled, leaving angry red patches on her palms. She ignored the pain, wrapping them in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat. She and Caleb worked as a team. He was small but tireless, dragging branches and smaller logs she felled from the riverbank into their protected alcove. They used the largest stones they could roll from the riverbed to build a low wall, creating a three-sided space with the massive pier as its back. It was crude, ugly work. The stones were slippery and ill-fitting. The mud they used as mortar was cold and gritty. But slowly, painstakingly, a shape began to emerge. A shelter. The first system she built was for heat. Against the granite pier, she constructed a fireplace. It was a simple, U-shaped structure of stacked, flat stones, mortared with a thick slurry of river clay and sand. Building the chimney was the greatest challenge. She couldn't go up, through the bridge. Instead, she angled it, a long, low flue of carefully fitted rocks that vented the smoke out from under the bridge's arch, where the prevailing wind would catch it and tear it away. It took 3 days of grueling labor. Her back screamed in protest, and her arms felt like lead, but she did not stop. On the third evening, with a low roof of woven branches and packed mud overhead, she laid the first fire. She used the last of their tinder and watched with breathless anxiety as the small flame flickered, caught, and then roared to life. The smoke, instead of filling their small enclosure, drafted sluggishly at first, then streamed up the flue and vanished into the evening air. The fire's heat hit the stone pier, and the effect was immediate. The granite began to warm, not just near the flames, but all along its surface, a gentle, radiant heat that pushed back the damp chill. Ilara slumped against the warm stone, tears of exhaustion and triumph stinging her eyes. It worked. The second system was for Old Bess. Next to their own shelter, Ilara and Caleb built a pen for the sow, again using the stone pier as the back wall. It was a sturdy enclosure of thick logs driven deep into the earth and lashed together. The pig's presence was a vital part of the design. Her large body generated a significant amount of heat, which was trapped in the small space and contributed to the overall warmth of their shared wall. She was not just a source of future food, she was a living furnace. Feeding the pig became a humiliating but essential ritual. Each dawn, before the town was fully awake, Ilara would walk to the edge of Providence Creek with a bucket. She would scavenge from the refuse piles behind the inn and the mercantile, collecting vegetable peels, stale bread, and sour milk. The first few times, she felt the burn of shame hot on her cheeks. She was a beggar, picking through garbage. But then she would look at the sow, growing fatter by the day, and at her children, who were warm and fed, and the shame was replaced by a grim pragmatism. This was not begging. This was harvesting. Water was the easiest system. The river was a constant, if murky, supply. She established a strict rule. No water was to be drunk unless it was boiled first. A large cast-iron pot, scavenged from a dump pile and painstakingly scoured clean, was always simmering by the fire. Food was a constant struggle. The salt she had bought was for preserving. When Caleb managed to catch a rabbit in one of the simple snares she taught him to make, she would butcher it carefully, smoking the meat over the fire and salting strips to be stored for later. She discovered a small, protected patch of land near the bridge abutment that was filled with rich silt from 100 years of floods. Here, she planted a small, desperate garden of hardy greens and root vegetables grown from seeds she had carefully saved from her old life. Her world shrank to the rhythms of this place. Chop wood, haul water, tend the fire, feed the pig, check the snares, forage for edible roots along the riverbank. The labor was endless, a physical punishment that left her so exhausted by nightfall that sleep was a black, dreamless pit. But with each completed task, with every log added to the woodpile, every salted strip of meat hung to dry, a sense of security grew. She was not waiting for rescue. She was not a victim. She was a builder. The town of Providence Creek watched her efforts with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Her trips to the refuse piles were noted. The plume of smoke from under the bridge was a daily topic of conversation at the Mercantile. The story of her foolishness grew into a local legend. The children in town, with the casual cruelty of their age, invented a name for Ilara's children. They called them the Bridge Trolls. When Caleb came home one day from a trip to the edge of town, his lips split and his eyes burning with tears of rage, Ilara held him tight and felt her own anger harden into a cold, protective shield. Mayor Gable, seeing her persist, took it as a personal affront to his sensible advice. "It's a disgrace," he declared one afternoon in the Mercantile to a crowd of nodding onlookers. "Living in filth under a bridge with a pig for a neighbor. I give her till first frost. She'll come crawling, begging for a spot in that orphanage for those poor children." The men around him called her new home the Widow's Sty, or, when feeling particularly witty, Gable's Folly. One day, a hunter named Brant, a man known for his rugged self-assurance, rode his horse down to the riverbank to see the spectacle for himself. He stared down at her muddy, smoke-stained home, at the pig in its pen, and at Ilara herself, her face smudged with soot, her hands calloused and scarred. He laughed, a loud, booming sound. "Well, I'll be," he shouted down, "a cave girl. You'd have been better off taking your chances with the wolves, woman." Ilara did not shout back. She did not look up. She simply hefted her axe and split a log with a single, clean stroke. The sharp crack echoed under the bridge. Brant watched for a moment longer, then shook his head and rode away, the story of the mad widow already forming on his lips. Deep winter arrived, and with it, the first true test. The temperature plummeted. The river froze over, save for a fast-moving channel in the center. The town of Providence Creek hunkered down by their fires. But under the bridge, a strange equilibrium was reached. The massive stone pier, having absorbed weeks of heat from the fire, now radiated a steady, gentle warmth that kept the worst of the frost at bay. The snow that fell on the bridge deck above acted as a colossal blanket of insulation. Their shelter was cold, yes, but it was a dry, still cold, a manageable cold. It was not the biting, wind-driven enemy that clawed at the walls of the houses in town. Their routine became a sacred text, a series of rituals that kept them alive. In the morning, break the ice on the river for water. Feed old Bess, who was now enormously pregnant. Check the snares. Chop wood from the stockpile they had built under the bridge, a great wall of logs that was completely dry and accessible. In the afternoon, Ilara would teach the children their letters, scratching words in the dirt floor with a stick. In the evening, they would huddle by the fire, eating their meager meal of rabbit stew or smoked fish, listening to the wind howl harmlessly overhead. They were utterly alone, a tiny island of life in a frozen world. They were the sovereigns of their own small kingdom. One bitterly cold night in January, old Bess gave birth. Ilara and Caleb worked by lantern light, creating a warm, dry nest of straw she had painstakingly gathered and dried. 8 healthy piglets were born, squealing and vigorous. Ilara looked at them, a tangible promise of their future, and felt a profound sense of victory. They had survived. More than that, they were growing. Spring brought a new test, the thaw. The river, choked with melting ice, swelled into a raging brown torrent. It rose higher and higher, consuming the banks and creeping toward their shelter. The townspeople watched from the safety of the bridge deck above, waiting for the flood to sweep away the widow's foolish home. The water licked at the edges of their low stone wall, but the massive pier stood firm, a granite bulwark that broke the force of the current, creating a pocket of calm water around them. The shelter held. When the waters receded, leaving behind a new layer of rich silt, Ilara simply rebuilt the damaged wall, stronger this time. The following year passed in a similar rhythm of labor and small victories. The piglets grew fat. Ilara began to trade, sending Caleb into town with smoked hams and bacon to sell to the innkeeper, who cared more for quality than for gossip. The coins he brought back were used to buy flour, more salt, and a few precious books for the children. The name Bridge Trolls was heard less often. The town's mockery softened into a kind of grudging acceptance. The widow under the bridge was still an oddity, but she was a permanent one. Then came the winter of '83. It began not with a gentle snow, but with a deep, unnatural freeze that locked the land in a grip of iron. The sky turned a strange, bruised purple, and the air grew deathly still. Ilara felt it in her bones. This was different. She and Caleb worked feverishly, reinforcing the shelter, bringing the now-grown pigs into their larger, sturdier pen, and double-stacking the woodpile until it reached the stone ceiling. The blizzard arrived like a hammer. It was not a storm. It was a physical entity, a screaming white demon that descended upon Providence Creek. The wind didn't howl, it shrieked, a solid wall of force that tore shingles from roofs and shattered windows. Snow fell not in flakes, but in blinding, horizontal sheets. The world beyond the shelter of the bridge vanished into a maelstrom of white chaos. Inside the town, conventional life collapsed. The wooden houses, built to withstand ordinary winters, were no match for this onslaught. The wind found every crack, every seam, filling homes with frigid drafts and piles of fine snow. Roofs, unable to bear the impossible weight of the snow, began to groan and splinter. The great bell tower of the meeting hall, the town's designated emergency shelter, cracked with a sound like a gunshot, and then collapsed in a cloud of shattered timber and dust. Firewood piles, stored in woodsheds and yards, were buried under 10-foot drifts, unreachable. Families found their fuel dwindling, then gone. Livestock, trapped in barns, began to freeze to death in their stalls. The carefully constructed world of Providence Creek, its picket fences and neat houses, was being systematically dismantled. The community's confidence shattered like ice under a heel. They were trapped, isolated, and freezing in the very homes that were supposed to protect them. But under the bridge, there was a profound and eerie calm. The wind shrieked 50 feet above their heads, a sound disconnected from their reality. The snow piled up on the bridge, insulating them further. The great stone pier, their silent granite guardian, radiated its stored warmth, creating a small pocket of life in the midst of a frozen apocalypse. The fire burned steadily in the hearth, its smoke pulled cleanly away by the flue. The pigs snorted contentedly in their pen, warm and sheltered. The water hole in the river, protected by the overhang, remained accessible. Ilara and her children were not fighting the storm. They were simply outside its reach. They were an island, not of land, but of warmth and order in an ocean of chaos. On the third day of the blizzard, as Ilara was salting a fresh side of bacon, she heard a sound. It was a frantic banging, not on a door, but on the thick wooden logs of the pig pen. Caleb grabbed a heavy branch from the fire, his face grim. Ilara motioned for him to wait, her hand on the handle of her axe. A voice, hoarse and weak, called out, "Help! Please, help!" Ilara unbarred the small gate to their living area. A figure stumbled in and collapsed onto the dirt floor, a snowman come to life. As she brushed the snow from his face, she froze. It was Silas, her brother-in-law, the man who had locked the door on her, who had given her a worthless deed and sent her out to fail. His face was blue with cold, his beard encrusted with ice. Caleb stood over him, the fiery branch held like a weapon. "Mother?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The air was thick with the memory of injustice. Here, at their feet, was the author of their hardship, now helpless. The choice was stark, a moral crossroads presented in the flesh. She could leave him to the cold he had so casually sentenced them to. It would be justice. But as she looked at Silas's shivering form, she did not see the smug man on the porch. She saw a human being on the edge of death. And she saw her own children watching her, their faces illuminated by the firelight, waiting to see what she would do. Her response would teach them more than any book or lesson. She took the branch from Caleb's hand and placed it back on the fire. "Drag him closer to the hearth," she said, her voice devoid of triumph, "and get a warm blanket." This was not about justice. This was about survival. And survival was for everyone, or it was for no one. They worked to save him, forcing warm broth between his chapped lips, piling blankets on his shaking body. When he could finally speak, his words came in ragged gasps. The roof of his farmhouse had collapsed. His wife and children were huddled in the cellar, the last of their firewood gone. "The town," he whispered, his eyes wide with horror. "It's gone. People are dying in their homes. Mayor Gable, his wife has the lung fever. Their house is like a tomb of ice." Elara did not hesitate. The rescue began. She packed a crude sled they had built for hauling wood. She loaded it not with vengeance, but with life. A heavy, cured ham, a dozen links of smoked sausage, armfuls of dry, precious firewood, blankets woven from salvaged wool. She looked at Caleb, no longer a boy, but a young man forged in hardship. "Stay here. Keep the fire going. Bar the door. I will be back." But Caleb shook his head, his jaw set. "We go together." They pushed the sled out from under the bridge and into the hellscape of the blizzard. The wind hit them like a physical blow, stealing their breath. The snow was so deep it was like wading through a frozen sea. They navigated by memory, following the ghostly shapes of buried fences toward the center of town. It was a journey of a few hundred yards that took them over an hour. They reached Mayor Gable's house first. It was dark, silent, and half buried in a drift. Elara pounded on the door. After a long moment, it opened a crack. The mayor peered out, his face a gray mask of despair. He saw Elara and Caleb, their faces rimed with frost, standing beside a sled laden with food and wood. He simply stared, his mind unable to process the sight. The woman he had dismissed, the children he had pitied, the bridge trolls from the widow's sty, were standing on his porch like angels of deliverance. They pushed past him into the house. The cold inside was somehow worse than the cold outside. It was a dead, still cold that clung to the furniture and the air. In a bed, huddled under a thin quilt, lay his wife, her breathing shallow and ragged. Elara went to work immediately. While Caleb expertly laid a fire in the hearth with their dry wood, she sliced off thick pieces of ham and set them to sizzle in a pan. The smell of cooking meat, of warmth, of life, filled the frozen room. Mayor Gable sank into a chair, his head in his hands. He watched her, this woman he had judged so easily. He watched her wrap his wife in a warm blanket, watched her feed the woman life-saving spoonfuls of hot broth. He saw the quiet competence, the strength that flowed not from pride, but from an unbreakable will. "We called your home a sty," he finally said, his voice cracking with a shame so profound it was a physical pain. "My God, we were the fools. We built our houses of wood and pride. You built on rock." Elara looked at him, her face calm in the flickering firelight. She offered no words of triumph, no bitter reminders of his scorn. Her grace was a blade that cut him to the core. "Your wife needs warmth," she said simply. "The children in this town need to eat. That is all that matters now." For the next 2 days, Elara's shelter under the bridge became the heart of Providence Creek. From her fortress of stone and warmth, she and Caleb launched rescue missions, pushing the sled from house to house, delivering firewood and food to the desperate. They brought the sickest, including Mayor Gable's wife, back to their shelter, where the steady, radiant heat of the great stone pier nursed them back from the brink. The people who entered her home were stunned into silence. They saw the neat, ordered space, the healthy animals, the stores of preserved food. They saw the miracle she had built from their refuse, their mockery, and a worthless piece of land. They had called her foolish, but she was the only one who had been wise. When the blizzard finally broke and a weak sun shone on the wreckage of Providence Creek, the town was forever changed. The derisive nicknames were retired, spoken only in whispers of shame. Her home was no longer the widow's sty. The townspeople, searching for a name to capture the truth of it, began to call it the Foundation, or sometimes simply Elara's Arch. People came to her, not with pity, but with respect that bordered on reverence. They came to trade for her famous cured pork, but they also came for advice. How to build a fireplace that held the heat. How to brace a wall against the wind. How to find the hidden strengths in a piece of land. Silas, humbled and broken, came and offered her the old farm back, the deed in his trembling hand. Elara looked at the paper, then back at her home, nestled securely against the ancient stone. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice gentle. "But I already have a home." She had not reclaimed her old life. She had built a new one, stronger and truer than anything she had lost. The town of Providence Creek rebuilt, but they rebuilt differently. New houses were constructed with deep stone foundations. Windbreaks of hardy trees were planted. The lessons learned from the blizzard, lessons taught by the widow under the bridge, were etched into the community's memory. Her story became a legend, told to children on winter nights, a story of how a woman with nothing had saved them all. Years later, Elara stood at the entrance to her home. It was a permanent structure now, with walls of stone and a proper door, but it was still anchored to the great pier. Her children were grown. Caleb was a builder, known throughout the county for his strong, sensible designs. Leah was the town's teacher. Samuel was preparing to study medicine. She watched the river flow past, constant and eternal. She looked up at the massive stone arch that had been her roof, her wall, her salvation. The world had given her a worthless place, a place of shadows and refuse. But she had seen its secret. She had found the rock beneath the mud. She had learned that true strength, the kind that endures any storm, is not found in what you are given, but in the foundation you build from the very things that others throw away.